I feel it's like a deja vu all over again for 20-something years. Dr. Orlov and I obviously grew up together. Since the early 90s, we've been seeing each other here in Monterey and in Moscow and in Europe and in many other countries. And our career paths went different directions. Obviously, I stayed in Russian studies here in the United States, and Dr. Vladimir Orlov, became truly a star in the field of non-proliferation in Russia. He was probably in the 90s the youngest expert who was trained at Vladimir, and I believe had Spanish and English work in Latin America, and then chose non-proliferation as a focus of his work and established Peer Center, which is very well known to not just to Monterey Institute students, but it's very highly respected journal publication on security affairs, security index in Russia. And the most important achievement of Vladimir Orlov is that he's the founder and director of Peer Center, the premier think tank in Russia on security issues. He's editor-in-chief of Security Index, and he's a member of the advisory board to the United Nations Secretary-General on Disarmament Matters. I also would like to mention, because we have a majority of our guests today are students, he's the editor and the contributor to a textbook on non-proliferation. That's the first textbook on non-proliferation that was ever published in Russia, and it will be in its 4th edition now. We asked Dr. Orlov today to speak on the nuclear non-proliferation and Russia's security policy priorities. This is the presentation that we're going to hear today. This will be the 3rd presentation of Dr. Orlov here in Monterey this time. He is lecturing, giving a series of lectures on security affairs related to Russian foreign policy. And his final lecture will be next Tuesday, which will also take place here at the Institute, and it will be in Russian. So with this introduction, let me also mention that our format of work today will be about 40 minutes presentation and then Q&A without a break, the usual format for such gatherings. And welcome, Dr. Orlov. It's a great pleasure to see you here and to be able to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vasilyev. Спасибо большое, Anna, for this very, very warm introduction. It is true, coming to Monterey for me is like coming to my second home. I came here first time in 1992. Of course, I'm proud to be associated with what is known internationally as Monterey Mafia, Monterey Non-Proliferation Mafia, which basically not controls all the decisions, but definitely influences many decisions related to the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And many thanks go to Professor Porter, who is in this room. Thank you, Bill, for your wisdom, for your courage, and also for encouraging not only myself, but many of my colleagues and friends to contribute to the nuclear non-proliferation regime strengthening. It is also true, of course, that coming to Monterey is always a challenge, because when the weather is like this, I know that people do enjoy it not only indoors but outdoors. And many of us in Russia, and here is a trick for the interpreters, know Monterey as Monterey, or Monte Paradise, translating from Russian. So I'm, of course, always coming here a little bit jealous for those of you who spent a longer time at this wonderful land. As Professor Vasilyev introduced myself, I do not need to do more of my introduction, but what I wanted to mention before I start my presentation is that I definitely speak here only for myself. I do not speak for any other organization I'm associated with. I even do not speak for Peer Center. For those of you who follow Russia and Russian politics, it may be surprising that NGOs dealing with international affairs and international security still exist in Russia. And if they do, Peer Center is one of those very few remaining where non-governmental independent institute, and here is the website of the institute, and of course each of us has their own opinion, his or her own opinion on this or that issue of Russian foreign policy, international security, and I'm sure for what I will be telling you now, some of my colleagues and friends at the Peer Center may put it in a completely different way. So this is a disclaimer that these are only my views reflected here. Among my positions, Anna mentioned, there is also my position as director of Center for Global Trends and International Organizations with the Foreign Ministry's Diplomatic Academy of Russia. This also means that I do not speak for the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation here, and you will get it just in a minute that definitely I do not. Okay, now it's time to turn on this thing. Yeah? You hear me well? Good. So I will start with a story that happened to me maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Not this year, earlier than that. When I was talking to a senior Russian diplomat dealing with the issues we're going now to discuss, nuclear non-proliferation. And he told me, Volodya, let's think, how should we put the case that NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is important for Russia. That was not what I expected to discuss with him. I was thinking of discussing some details of Iranian nuclear program, whatever else, but not that we need to save the NPT in Moscow from those in Moscow who do not think that NPT itself is important for Russia. First moment, I thought the task was too easy, actually, to do, because it was so obvious that Russia, as a nuclear weapon state, is very much interested in keeping NPT not only alive, but quite dynamic and active. But then I realized that my knowledge of the Kremlin Byzantium is not good, because some people in Kremlin, they were taught not necessarily at the Monterey Institute or in GIMO in Moscow, or even if they were taught somewhere there, they spent quite a number of years on the east coast of the United States, being Russian officials there. And they learned from your previous administrations, specifically from George W. Bush Jr., that treaty is not necessarily so important, and that maybe it's always better to not be bound by international commitments. They actually were putting George W. Bush behavior as an example for future Russian behavior. Well, maybe at the first moment I was surprised. Today I'm not at all surprised about that. And I must tell you that there is a real battle now these days in Moscow between those who do believe that the treaties and international obligations and that the non-proliferation structure which is here today matters, and those who believe this is American-managed architecture, And this is why Russia, at the minimum, should ignore it, at the maximum, should withdraw. To understand better why this battle goes on, for me it is more interesting to tell you about what is the current thinking in Moscow on the broader security spectrum issues, and also then, of course, on non-proliferation, disarmament, and the related topics, so that you understand what is not my logic, not your logic, but the logic of people who are making decisions, or who are parties of those battles I just mentioned in Moscow. I will start with a description of strategic planning, which goes on in Kremlin under President Putin these days and for the future. Then I will give you some idea of security threat perception, so that you understand what Russia looks as threats to its security, and is certainly projected to the topic of our discussion. And finally, I will just tell you what it means and what it can mean for the Russian non-proliferation policy. Yeah, this is what is on the screen, are doctrinal documents which are now active in the Russian decision-making, though it is also true that after the Ukraine crisis, after it started, and after the Cold War 2.0 started spring this year, of course, some of the documents are being revised, or will be revised, most specifically elements of the Russian military doctrine, though it entered into force not that long ago. Here is what I will show you, what has been not necessarily on the desktop of President Putin. I don't know what is on his desktop, but definitely what being planned and being projected are in Kremlin for the next few years planning. And here is the first thing, which people, even in January, February this year, still kept very high on their priorities. Russia's G8 presidents, Sochi Olympics. Further on, it will be soccer, or football as we call it, of course, World Cup hosted by Russia already in the future, in the 2018. Closer to politics, though of course soccer is very much politics and the Olympics are very much politics, is Russian chairmanship at Shanghai Cooperation Organization this year and next year. Next year's Russian presidency with the BRICS. And believe it or not, we also have elections. And we have our next parliamentary elections the year 2016 to the State Duma, and only 2018 presidential elections. Last but not least, in presidential planning, 2020 is the year where the results of Russia's development strategy should be presented to the general public. So kind of 10-year planning, which should be delivered by either Putin-Medvedev team or Putin-Putin team, or kind of that leadership. What is important here for our conversation? Of course, what is in the past rather than in the future at the first place. Of course, this did not happen. President Putin was going to meet the leaders of the other G8 nations in Sochi in June this year. As Foreign Minister Lavrov later commented, they just didn't want to, were too lazy to come to Sochi, of course, the reason was slightly different. And while G7 still exists, it exists outside Russia. And those who tell me that this is only temporary, that Russia is out of G8, fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the current Russian decision-making. What is also important that such elements as Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS are here on the scene. What is less important, but also important, is that parliamentary elections are relatively close, which means that our parliament, which is the most hardline legislature in all of the Russian recent history, would make the best to show their cases as patriots, as nationalists, and make their cases even stronger in the months to come. But still there is much time before the next presidential election, so President Putin, as almost always, has his hands mostly free. Russia's threat perception, according to the doctrinal documents, to the Russian security strategy. Look, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and this is very close to the hearts of those of you who came here to listen more on non-proliferation and less on Russia. This is definitely in the doctrinal, in the documents, on the top priority for Russia. And it was not once or twice when President Putin also mentioned that proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is #1 security priority for him. Then it goes increase of number and role of non-state actors, primarily of terrorist organizations. So fighting violent non-state actors is #2 priority as declared in the Russian documents. #3 is much more specific, problems with global stability caused by the global or strategic missile defense development by the United States. So very specific point compared to other more general points. And then illicit drug trafficking, which is very relevant to Russia, and cyber wars and cyber crimes. Now let us see what is here looking like a small script, but as you all know, small script, this is what matters. And in this case, small script matters more than what you have in the doctrines. And these are most recent comments by President Putin. One of the major speeches was made to the Russian ambassadors. He gathered in Moscow in July, and then his most recent speech to the Vladimir Forum in Sochi. Instead of addressing G8, he addressed experts on Russia there. And this is what really now very much in mind of the Russian real, not declared, but real decision makers. They are very concerned of uncertainty of international situation. The word uncertainty, неопределенность, comes a lot. Together with growth of conflict potential, sharpening of contradictions, and growing chaos in world affairs. Putin does not like chaos. He likes structure, he likes stability and predictability. #3, unilateral diktat and US-made templates for global solutions. The unipolar world, in Putin's view, is simply a means of justifying dictatorship over people and countries, and of course dictatorship comes from the United States. Clearly, United States here is viewed as a problem, not as a solution for international relations and for bringing this uncertain and chaotic situation back to order. The problem with national sovereignty is also of much concern for Russia, together with the attempt of those who provide diktat to organize color revolutions in different parts of the world. In fact, in Russian view, there are only a small group of really sovereign countries. Russia is among them, and for Putin, this is a defix, that Russian sovereignty should not be diminished. Then, according to the official document, non-compliance to norms of international law is also very high on the agenda of concerns. But look how Russian leaders see what international law means. It's not only treaties, it's also principles of truth, justice, and respect to one's partner's interests. Threats to Russian compatriots around the globe, what in Russia means представители широкого русского мира, is also another challenge which is mentioned. Growing threat of extremism and radicalism. This is a much vaguer definition than the previous ones, because when we try to realize what radicalism and extremism can mean, actually any activities not sanctioned by the government can be part of extremism. Russian legislation definitely cannot put you pressure if you think differently and if you speak differently. But if you speak differently, it can be claimed that you are extremist, and then the criminal code and all the Russian law enforcement machinery would be against you. NATO trend of expansion towards Russian borders. This is more or less traditional statement, but still there. And of course, with the Ukraine situation, maybe even higher or in the agenda. Then a more specific point again. Many types of high-precision weaponry, conventional weapons, are already close to the WMD. Increased probability of chain-on conflicts between or with indirect involvement of major powers. This is something new. In previous doctrinal documents, the risk of conflict or war involving major powers, and Russia is definitely one of them, was more or less out of picture, out of the center of the picture. Now it is again still there. And finally, we see that the Russian leadership is quite puzzled, because while it is certainly against the unipolar world and the attempts of the United States to provide a diktat in global affairs, they also recognize that polycentric world does not improve stability. In fact, it's more likely to be the opposite. And the goal of reaching global equilibrium is what in his Putin mind, is turning into a very difficult puzzle. So Putin is now playing puzzles and trying to put it right. This map I from time to time show in different audiences for quite a few years. Really, you can tell me it's quite outdated. 2003, compared to very fresh data and information. Why should I keep it here? Not because I forgot to remove it, but very much for purpose. It is still very much valid. It is general stuff of the Russian Armed Forces document, and I put it here just exactly as it is in Russian. It does not exist in its English version in official documents, and this is a public page, so I can use it freely. These circles, meaning in most cases sources, geographical sources of threat to Russia. The major, of course, comes from West, from NATO. The risk of increase of military presence in even those countries of NATO which currently do not have it. And again, it was 2003. This is exactly what is going on now to 2014. In that sense, Russian military analysts were
probably very much correct. Then there are two circles here in the Middle East and here in East and Northeast Asia. They both are very much relevant to nuclear and missile proliferation threats, because this is, in the view of the Russian military, is major sources of threat to Russian security, coming both from regional conflict, potential regional conflict, and possession of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction and then means of delivery by certain countries of the region, or their developed or planned nuclear military programs. And this big circle, this is not a threat, quite the opposite. This is an opportunity in the view of the Russian military. This is zone of peace and stability within Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I shouldn't remind this audience that definitely China is one of the major, if not the major player in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In that sense, Russian military's vision of the world, threats here, solutions here. Now coming back to general public, this is not Kremlin sociological polling. I didn't poll it in Kremlin or around. This is what Russian general public was asked. Who will use or threaten to use nuclear weapons? What states are WMD threats to Russia? This is what my institute, Peer Center, asked through all Russian sociological polling quite a few years ago, 2006. You see, United States was mentioned as number one threat, 30%. China was mentioned probably together with Iran. Of course, not everybody is so well trained to know that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Anyway, it was mentioned here, and Pakistan and DPRK were going next. What is not on the screen is that more than 80% of people also indicated terrorist organizations, non-state actors, as the source of threat to Russia, which was much more important for the Russian public than the United States in 2006. This is very fresh. This is what was not done by Peer Center, but by Общественное мнение Foundation. This is what Russians think now. 50%, slightly more, believe that the United States will use or will threat to use nuclear weapons. Not necessarily against Russia, so this is not exactly the full parallel here between the questions. And look, DPRK, Pakistan go much less here compared to the United States, and China definitely less. And Russia itself, people do not believe that Russia will use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against others. So this is Russian public perception. It goes very, very much in line with the official perception. And of course, this is mutually reinforcing figures. Russian leadership cannot completely ignore the feelings of the Russian public, and Russian public certainly gets it from the Russian state TV and other propaganda channels. What is important to see when you look at the Russian security policy, foreign policy, and of course non-proliferation policy? There are 5 contradictions generally in the Russian foreign policy today. And when I'm saying contradiction, I'm not necessarily blaming Russian foreign ministry for that. I'm playing more just a therapist here who identifies the problem, but not necessarily saying that it is what somebody should blame for. But let's see. The first one. Definitely clear need for the economic modernization, which was declared by the former president Medvedev, but nothing was really done here. And growing isolationism by Russia, which is taken with applaud by a significant element of the current Russian elite. Do not believe those who say that all the Russian elite has their kids in London, have their money in London or whatever. No, they have their financial interests in Russia. They are happy to push others out of Russia. Their kids go to schools in Moscow. And in that sense, this is very nationalistic elite who is happy and starving for more and more isolationism of Russia. The second contradiction is between declared change of geographic priorities or structural priorities in Russian foreign policy cooperation, clearly with BRICS, with Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or geographically more with non-US Asia Pacific, and de facto still bipolar vision of the world. And this is very interesting and tricky when non-proliferation is concerned, where United States is still seen as #1 rival, but also #1 partner. When you need to discuss some really important stuff, you do not call Angela Merkel, you still call President Obama. Contradiction number 3, renewed great power status, clearly it is there, and lack of capability or ability to promote Russia's interests through multilateral diplomacy. There are a lot of grand initiatives, which you probably study, those of you who study Russian foreign policy issues, or European Security Treaty, whatever. But when you compare the left column initiative with the right column, achieved or not, adopted or not, then you see how poor Russia has been playing here. Number 4, reliance on nuclear weapons, now and for the foreseeable future, and insufficient development of modern conventional capability. This contradiction is publicly recognized, is recognized by the Russian military and political leadership, and the work is underway to correct the second part of the paradigm, investing heavily in conventional modern capability. Whether it would echo in the eagerness of Russia to work on reductions of nuclear weapons in the future, when this conventional capability improvement is achieved, is of course not clear. And contradiction number 5, increase of importance of space warfare and cyber warfare, which is recognized by the Russian doctrinal documents and very practical documents of the Russian General Staff on the armed forces, and at the same time lack of efficient diplomatic instruments to prevent threats coming from them. Lack of NPT for 21st century style or type of document, draft document, ambition, or even vision. Here also there is some work going on by the Russian diplomacy, both on the space security issue, of course, together with China in Geneva and some other related efforts, and also more and more on the cyber front, trying to push to take it from ICANN, taking it from the current internet governance to a very different way of internet governance, but so far these are very, very initial steps, and Russia definitely is not a global leader for promoting those new ideas. Okay, now I'm coming to the final part of my presentation. How all these things, contradictions of the Russian foreign policy goals, and just the current Russian situation domestically, very challenging, how they echo nuclear non-proliferation and arms control. First and foremost, Russia just cannot ignore the fact, and those here in the room already were at my previous lectures already saw this map, that most of the nuclear non-proliferation challenges are located close to the Russian borders or borders of the Russian allies. Russia doesn't have many allies. Well, it's of course the army and the fleet, as it was said in the 19th century, but it's also CSTO members, mostly in Central Asia. In that sense, for Russia and its very few allies, all three areas of proliferation, instability, and challenge where NPT doesn't prove to be a universal treaty yet. Of course, they are very important for Russia. Russia simply cannot ignore it, neither militarily nor politically. This is what you all are familiar with, been in Monterey, the Monterey Institute. Those who are not, these are three pillars of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Peaceful uses of nuclear energy, disarmament, and non-proliferation. We can go in any order you like. The most important that the pillars should be equal and all three present. For those of us who value NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty itself, and nuclear non-proliferation current regime, this is just that obvious that all three pillars should be observed and promoted. With peaceful users of nuclear energy, this is not that much problem, and I would probably not spend much time on it in my presentation. And if those of you who are interested, there is Q&A session for that. This is a map, just last month, from Russian exports of both current nuclear export and also planned nuclear export. So it includes the actual contracts, agreements, and MOUs with the nations. Look how big and diverse the geography is. And of course, it is true that it is going on. For instance, just last month, Bolivia was added to the list, and more countries with whom Russia either starts construction of nuclear power plants, like for instance Vietnam or Jordan, or where Russia has in mind building of nuclear power plants if financial and other circumstances allow that to do so. But this is really ambitious. And this is why Russia is on the forefront of supporters of nuclear energy development, if this nuclear energy is, of course, peaceful. In that context, Russia does plan to expand its presence in places like Iran. This is much more complex, Russia and nuclear disarmament. Of course, some of you who follow Russian developments here closely know quite well that a few months ago, that Bush-style view on disarmament issues prevailed in Moscow. Even the same name, disarmament, disappeared from the name of the Russian Foreign Ministry Department in charge of this issue. It was called before Department of Disarmament and Security Matters. Currently, it is called Department of Non-Proliferation and Arms Control, just because it was said that disarmament in its current meaning is meaningless, whatever it means. But this is interesting. This is not my phrase. This is President Putin's phrase just a few days ago. Now, President Putin, for the first time in many months, came back to the issue of not only nuclear arms control, not only to the issue of strategic stability and arms control, but also to the nuclear disarmament. He said that many states, in his opinion, I will disagree, but he believes many states, to ensure their sovereignty, want to obtain their own bombs, meaning nuclear bombs. This is extremely dangerous, yeah, sure. We insist, Russia insists, on continuing talks. We are not only in favor of talks on nuclear issues, but insist of continuing talks to reduce nuclear arsenals, The less nuclear weapons we have in the world, the better. And we are ready for these most serious, concrete discussions on nuclear disarmament. Still many people are puzzled why he used the phrase disarmament, whether it just slipped out of his tongue. Less likely, he is not that type of a guy. In that sense, there will be an interesting move of Russia, maybe to another grand initiative, or maybe to a very special set of steps prior to the NPT Review Conference of the year 2015 to show that Russia is sincerely, or pragmatically, whatever you like, interested in nuclear disarmament. When it comes to nuclear non-proliferation, there are two key words which are fighting between each other, not only words, but also worlds, and also groups in the Russian decision-making community, those battles to which I referred in the beginning of my speech. The first element is договариваться, which is to make agreements, to make arrangements. Putin used the word договариваться quite often in his recent address. For him, the solution from that house is in договариваться, in making arrangements. If this is true, he puts as examples of how people should договариваться, how people should make arrangements, how it was done with the Syrian chemical weapons, and how it has been done with Iranian nuclear program, and for some reason he also mentions North Korea. I'm not sure that we have so much success there, but this is what he says, that there are some positive results. Good experience, he believes. But then there is a group which is called уважение, respect. And this is also Mr. Putin. So basically he represents both groups, or they are fighting, and he speaks to both of them, looking as an arbiter who will win. Or maybe he knows who will win. I don't know. And уважение means that who plays the cards of non-proliferation. If it is international community, that's fine. If this is United States, which uses non-proliferation card as a pretext to interventions, to pushing other countries like it was in Libya or earlier on in Iraq, or could happen in Syria, this is completely unacceptable for Russia. Look at this quotation to understand the logic of уважение. And then Putin says, well, he just mentioned Iranian nuclear program as a good example. He says everything has its limits. It might be possible that external circumstances can force us, Russia, to alter some of our positions, meaning particularly on Iran, but maybe also on existing arms control architecture. He didn't mention it, but of course, such issues as INF Treaty and others could be added here, where Russia would alter that position because the limits are the limits. And what are the limits reached for Putin is not clear. Of course, what went on Ukraine in February this year clearly made him furious, and for a good reason, at least as I believe. Russian nuclear weapons. Here, how Putin sees the situation. First, he says that nuclear weapons make Russia strong. That ordinary guy argument, which is very close to Putin's heart, at least these days. He quoted Nikita Khrushchev, and normally he's critical to Nikita Khrushchev, particularly the Crimea issue. But in this case, he believed that Khrushchev was respected, even with his odd presentation at the United Nations. Why? Because Russia had nuclear weapons. So with nuclear weapons, Russia is always respected. Then it went to be weak, which is completely impossible for Putin. This is humiliation for Russia. Soviet Union gone. And Russia was viewed as upper volta with missiles, he said. What happened? Nothing good for Russia. Strong again. Russia with nuclear weapons, only with nuclear weapons it can feel strong. The bear, this is what Putin says, will not even bother to ask permission. Look, here we consider here in Russia we consider bear master of the taiga, And I know for sure that it does not intend to move to any other climatic zones, even not to California. It will not be comfortable there. However, it will not let anyone have its taiga either. So I think this is the quintessence of the Putin's thinking. Nuclear weapons are needed and will be needed to guarantee Russian sovereignty. Whatever conventional capability Russia will reach in the future. So of course, these are all a very, very interesting set of puzzles we all experts now have. There are those battles which are very practical battles. At some point, when I mentioned nuclear disarmament in the front page of one of my peer center's brochures, I was not only criticized, I would say I'm a traitor, because disarmament is not the word Russia uses any longer. But of course, those camps who are promoting more international cooperation, who are promoting in Russia the value of international treaties, NPT included, or NPT primarily, and those who just do not care about it, they are now exactly in that very interesting dance. They are dancing together, and it is not clear where this dance will lead Russia to. And it is also not clear how it will echo for international architecture. Again, I'm here not to discuss European security architecture or US-Russian relations, though we can touch upon them in the Q&A. I have NPT review conference in mind, which will take place just in a few months from now. Traditionally, for many years and decades, and Professor Potter knows it quite much better than me, Soviet Union and the United States put aside their differences. Even in the worst times of the Cold War I, they managed to work together to keep Non-Proliferation Treaty going. In fact, Non-Proliferation Treaty itself was concluded in the times when Soviet tanks were entering Prague in '68. Whether it would be true for the Cold War II, I would love to say sure, but I'm not sure. Thank you.
All right, so now we're beginning our Q&A session. Please, when you come up to the microphone, identify yourselves. And we have until 1:15 today for the session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Orlov, for what I think really was a brilliant presentation. And what I particularly appreciate is the fact that having had the opportunity to interact with you for well over 2 decades, that you continue to have new and very interesting perspectives to share with us. And so I greatly appreciate your coming to Monterey and sharing your views. I have lots of questions that I could ask, but I'm going to limit my initial questions at least to 2 areas. One might actually interpret your discussion of the debate today in Russia over the direction of Russian non-proliferation policy as encouraging, because the debate suggests that there are in fact multiple players with different perspectives. And so my first question is, can you say a little bit more about the nature of this deliberation? To what extent are there actually meaningful contrasting players, including representatives from the traditional national security organs such as the Foreign Ministry, the Security Council, the Defense Ministry, Rosatom perhaps, Or are we really observing more artificial debates which are designed to promote an outcome that may be known in advance? And my second question has to do with what you've already identified as a very important, long-standing experience of cooperation between the United States, first the Soviet Union, and now Russia, in the realm of nonproliferation. One might also add more recently in nuclear security. And yet we've seen, actually preceding the events in Ukraine, some retrenchment in the Russian position in terms of engagement with the United States on nuclear issues, both in terms of initially indicating there was no interest in any immediate follow-on negotiations in the nuclear arms control realm, a winding down of engagement in cooperative threat reduction and related programs in Russia, and then most recently, and in some ways most strikingly, the boycott of one of the planning sessions leading up to the nuclear security summit, and the announcement by, I think, actually Sergei Kislyak a day or so ago that Russia, in fact, did not plan to attend the 2016 conference. So my question here is, to what extent are we still observing kind of tactical maneuvers? Because one can point to the recent return of highly enriched uranium from Kazakhstan and Poland, just I think a month or so ago. The newspapers suggest that Russia may still be playing a constructive role from the U.S. standpoint in terms of Iran. To what extent does that represent kind of an outlier or and a tactical move? Or really do we have to begin to ask, have we seen a fundamental reassessment and rejection of the value of collaboration with the United States on non-proliferation issues? Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. These are, of course, important set of questions. Thank you for the good words. The easiest part here would be to tell you whether the debate which is going on, which are, of course, very schematically described here, sketchily, whether it is a kind of artificial thing, whether it is a real thing. Well, you even cannot imagine how real it is. And I'm not sure whether debate in that sense is a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe it is a good thing that the door is not closed. There is another problem. Actually, under President Yeltsin's times, it was not uncommon when different Russian agencies or ministries had their own opinions and their own policies, non-proliferation issues included. It was very Byzantine style rule, and not necessarily Kremlin was under 100% control. Today, of course, it is different. President Putin and Kremlin are under control of 100% of the situation over there. And it's just both general managers and micromanagers, and this is what should be recognized. Having said that, we even cannot imagine what the war is going on between those structures and the official dome you just mentioned. And it is not the war of one group against the other. Again, for the sake of the presentation, I simplified the camps, putting them into two. There is war of everybody against everybody. Actually, of course, it is paradoxical that at some point Rosatom, just to give you one example, not to be too general here, Rosatom is promoting, in the middle of Novorossiya crisis, just exactly after the Malaysia Airlines Boeing was shut down, Rosatom still promoting continuation of Russian-Ukrainian nuclear ties. Because Rosatom believes this is important for the future of Russia, and no secret it is important for the Russian nuclear industry. But also to keep Ukraine at least partly in the Russian sphere of nuclear energy influence. At the same time, Russian Foreign Ministry torpedoes the Rosatom effort, saying that this is betrayal of the Russian interest. Of course, this doesn't come to the front pages of the stories, again, because everything is micromanaged in one place in Moscow, which in this case is maybe good news. But it is true that currently, when in Russia to be a patriot, to be proud of your country means that you should blame somebody else, and this somebody else is on the other hemisphere. So just if you blame the United States for all the bad things, so you gain the scores automatically. Not necessarily for top people in the foreign ministry, but for people at the mid-level. For them it's just an excellent moment to rise, because they can catch a Rosatom spy who works for Ukraine and for Ukrainian interests. And all these things go all around the spectrum, and not necessarily that defense ministry is unified. The defense ministry's analytical positions and general staff's practical positions are unified, and so on and so forth. So this is a very multiple conflict within. In theory, I would say yes, it should produce some very interesting and bright results, but it can produce also very, very damaging results. And this is the answer to the second part of your question, Bill. I'm afraid that I'm right, that Russian isolationism, to which I referred to, was not caused by Ukraine. Ukraine was just another drop, maybe a very big drop, maybe the final drop. But it was starting earlier than that. It was expanding, but it was starting much earlier than Ukraine, and Ukraine was a very nice proof of those Russians, including in the leadership, but also general public, who believe that isolation is a solution. Ukraine was just a very good proof to their fears, concerns, and predictions. In that sense, yes, Russia decided that it will not be part of the ISTC, International Science and Technology Center, already quite a few years ago. Russia said, we don't need that. Well, maybe the time was out for the ISTC. Do you need institutional memory, expertise of the ISTC, which is gathered for those 20 years or so? No, we don't. We're not interested. What about global partnership? Well, it corrupted quite a few of our officials. Some of them are in jail, some of them are overseas. That was the response. Yes, this is part of the picture, but very small, because the grand result of the global partnership and CTR was much larger than enrichment of half a dozen of Russian senior officials. It was actually a practical result in improving security. This is ignored, and a smaller picture made the only picture. This is a problem. People are not well educated. Our parliamentarians, believe it or not, I'm sure here in the United States it's a completely different situation. But in our legislature, people, not all of them are highly educated. This creates another part of the problem. In that sense, a Russian de facto withdrawal from a number of international mechanisms started definitely before the collapse of the G8. Collapse of the G8 could be even an excuse for those people who didn't want continuation of that cooperation in those formats. Maybe they will learn how to do it better in the BRICS format or in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization format. I'm sure they will, but maybe they're learning. Thank you.
You know, you point out all this interesting thing in terms of general changes that takes place that Ukraine obviously emphasize and enhance into almost a dramatic thing. But on the questions of the NPT non-proliferation, I can say the situation that, you know, you may not truly collaborate, or you show indifference, or you show dismissal. But it's different from what is the real alternative options? Do they really want to let it unravel? I mean, what is the other options available? I mean, after all, I mean, so it's one thing to, you know, to make a point to the United States within the larger, broader context of relationship. But it's another thing to let this regime go away. And I don't think that's their interest under any circumstances. So you can explain that.
Thank you, Aaron. No, this is definitely the difference between near-term planning and tactical moves and the strategic thinking. If you think that everybody thinks strategically on the NPT and the Moscow decision-making community, this is not exactly right. They think exactly about those periods of time I have indicated, 2016, 2018, maybe 2020, and they know that by that time NPT will not collapse anyway. At least they believe it will not collapse. So for them, the best option, again, for that camp who is not interested in legally binding solutions, in obligation, of course, is not killing the NPT. It doesn't make any sense why Russia should kill the NPT. No, this is not the point. The point is US-style behavior of the conference 2005. For those of us in non-proliferation community who follow those review conferences, that was a disaster. Nothing happened, very sad mood. And people in Moscow said, look, we should just take no commitments, no obligations. We can play those discussions all around about Article 6, about other things. We have some good things to promote related to internationalization of nuclear fuel cycle. No, nobody's against that. Nobody's against sending a delegation to New York, of course not. But action plan, even such a weak action plan as it was in 2010, some people already say, why that guy who headed that Russian delegation, who is now not with us, why he agreed to that action plan? We didn't need that. Even that, what for us is modest thing. I said, no, we should really have hands-free in that sense. Why we need the final document? Let those Arabs discuss all those things about the zone. It's not our business. It's not our problem. It's an interesting thing, actually, how Russia will proceed with talks with Iran. And for me, it will be, if not necessarily the litmus test, but at least some sign where it goes. We discussed it partly, actually, at the seminar with some of the people who are here in this room. In fact, Russia has choices now. One of the choices is actually to continue working on the agreement, on the comprehensive agreement, blessing it, saying yes, we also should be proud because, well, in part at least, it was based on the Lavrov plan. It doesn't matter, but Russia definitely had blessed it from the very beginning, including bilateral Iranian U.S. semi-secret rapprochement in the beginning. The second scenario can be trying to do, let's pretend that we are supportive, but in fact they will not reach anything, particularly after midterm elections here. Iranians would be even more suspicious to a future administration of the United States. They would not like to repeat the mistakes that North Korea almost did with the Clinton administration in the mid-90s. In that sense, it will not grow anyway. It will not produce fruits anyway. So Russia should not torpedo, but Russia should do not much at all. And the third scenario, which is also on the table, is, well, quite interesting, I would say. It is now time to explode all those talks. And now to use all Russian internal resources, which were sleeping for so many years, just to explode all that. Because then it will be good for Russia. Iran will not be back on the market with its oil. Russia will not lose Iran anyway, even in the contrast, it can strengthen relations with Iran. And then you have more cash, particularly when the economy is really struggling. And you lose nothing because you finally tell Americans that without Russia you can do nothing, or very little on Iran, because of course more and more people in America now believe that they can discuss things with Iran now bilaterally. Russia is not needed any longer. So Russia wants to send another signal. This is for Ukraine. This is for Ukraine. And this is for Ukraine. And just to be very frank, I don't know what of these, I mentioned even not two, but three scenarios, what of these scenarios would prevail. My guess, very humble guess, would be that scenario number two. Basically, we don't torpedo, but we don't help, because it will disintegrate anyway. It will not grow anyway. But there are some people quite activist in our decision-making community who say, no, Americans and Iranians are going and doing something. They're in the true. We should not ignore their rapprochement. We should now play our role to stop it. So we'll see.
Thank you for a very interesting and enlightening presentation. I know that in the Russian think tank community and within the research community, the idea of multilateral disarmament has been very popular. And how to achieve...
Multilateral disarmament?
Yes. How to achieve those steps towards this goal. And I'm just wondering if this idea is still alive, or is it disintegrating, or did Putin administration ever shared this goal? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. No, I think this is also part of that larger battle I just described, because where you can measure the behavior of countries related to multilateral disarmament. Of course, one place is the First Committee, but another place is Geneva Conference on Disarmament. Whether Russia wants to see a conference on disarmament dead or alive? Oh, more likely Russia wants to see a conference on disarmament alive. Is Russia ready to bring some fresh energy to conference on disarmament? I'm not sure at the moment. I think that Russia is very interested in certain elements on multilateral disarmament, if you like, agenda. And this is definitely not FMCT. FMCT is something which Russia can deal with, but absolutely when I started to just test the level of interest if you like, the level of testosterone and the Russian politicians taught the FMCT was close to zero. It was not negative, though. It was something, okay, whatever. When it comes to outer space, when it comes to space security, when it comes to already existing Russian-Chinese initiatives here in Draft Treaty, or other ways how we should work with the Europeans here, with others, even with the United States. Yeah, I see people are really interested and engaged. So probably if it were just completely Russia's choice, Russia would simplify the work of the Conference on Disarmament by just putting aside all other issues, which for Russia are not counterproductive but just boring, and put security of the space on top of the agenda. But things are not done, this is not multilateral diplomacy, right? Things are not done that way, and definitely they're not done that way in Geneva. So I can expect that, and I mentioned that if the decision is made that Russia should really be engaged in non-proliferation and disarmament matter, rather than to disengage or to show complete disinterest. If the decision is made like that, we should expect some Russian return to our initiatives at the conference on disarmament or around. Whether it's a healthy place to show your activism or not, this is another issue.
Hi, my name is Andrew Brown, and I'd like to also thank you again for speaking with us today. My question is on the Russian Federation perspective, or bureaucratic perspectives within the Russian Federation on the utility of the P5 process within the NPT context. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. This is a good question. Actually, for Russia, probably one of the highest values within the, let's say, broader NPT process is the P5 consultation process. This is something which meets the Russian interests, non-proliferation interests generally. And I referred to them. Russia wants to actually remind itself and others that it is in the very elite club, and P5 is that good reminder. This is why actually NPT definitely matters for Russia generally. Not everybody in Moscow realizes that's the point. Anyway, P5 is a good forum to look together at the things and to come up with a unified position to the NPT review process, and just to exchange opinions, to check the things under the closed doors of the nuclear weapon states. This is why, even in the heat of the Crimea/Ukraine crisis in April this year, Moscow, of course, sent its delegation to the P5 meeting. Well, it's also true that it took place in Beijing. I would put our small question mark what would have happened if the place would have been geographically different, particularly would have been in the United States. But still, I think Russia would have sent its delegation there. Having said that, well, I participated at least in one meeting of the P5 as a member of the Russian delegation, so I have my own, let's say, inner view of the P5. Look, if you know something more boring, where you really need to check all your email and still you have time, this is exactly the place. The most lively thing there, and when Chinese, for the 101st time, discuss the glossary of definitions, and then even Americans and Ross says, yes, yes, this is so good. Because really, compared to other nonsense discussions, this is something practical, though you hardly can sell it to people outside the P5. And of course, there are some other relatively useful things. For instance, what to get you together as P5 should boycott, or whether you should participate. And of course, the issue of humanitarian approaches is another good test case for that. When at the beginning, P5 coordinated that effort within itself, and just even the Brits, all right, but we want to, okay, but we will not this time. So it was a good coordination effort, very useful for Russia. Because the game within the P5 is always that Russia doesn't want to be the last, doesn't want to be to blame. Because when we do something, it was the case also in other fora where P5 is involved, like UN Security Council resolutions on Iran, when Russia's uncomfort came from the notion that China can vote for the sanctions, and then Russia would be the only one to blame. China could feel a very similar thing, and sometimes when disarmament is concerned, of course, three of us, Russia, China, and France, look together at each other, and no one wants to be the only one in the corner. So that kind of circle where there are no corners is quite helpful, although I'm not sure it has much sense in my view.
Thank you, Professor Orlov. I have two questions. One about Rosatom and the Russian civilian nuclear industry. Do you think the European Union sanctions are going to affect Rosatom? Because I know that in the summer, the Czech Republic pulled out of a deal with Rosatom to build a facility. And finally, do you think the Ukraine during the NPT is going to bring up something about the Budapest Memorandum? Thank you.
Okay, let's start with the Budapest Memorandum. I think that at the last PrepCon onto the NPT, one we had in New York this spring, the issue of Budapest Memorandum was mostly played down. We discussed it actually with some of the Soviets, with Professor. I think we have a common view here that it could have been louder. Even for the Russian delegation, the head of the delegation planned to come not the first day for the PrepCon, but then realizing that maybe the Ukraine issue already in the first day to change his plans, which means that Ukraine issue was not that major irritating so far. Whether it will change for the NPT review conference, as it may. I would say still it would not be top priority issues, definitely not compared to Article 6 related issues and to the zone-free weapons of mass destruction. And I think this is what Russia is looking for. Let's just put all the attention towards the Middle East related issues, and just as it happened in all the previous fora, the discussion on other issues would be somewhere in the schedule. Again, I'm not sure this exactly will be the case because Russia had its own explanation of the vision of the case. Some of us in the non-governmental community in Russia have their own explanations of that, but I'm sure that states who put their signatures there, including the United States and UK, may have their own plans here and not necessarily laying down the issue. And of course, it will be a game closer to the NPT record started in that sense. Russia may want to use the P5 discussions just to make sure that it will not happen in the sharpest form. On Rosatom and the sanctions. So far, so good. And people in Rosatom are not as much concerned on the sanctions, particularly because most of their business trips go to the places where sanctions do not matter. They're not European Union and not to the United States. So most of the potential contractors, and they showed it on the map, and partners of Russia are in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Middle East, and potentially in Africa and Latin America. So all those markets which are still there. Your question is more specific about Central and Eastern Europe. From what I knew from my Rosatom friends and interlocutors, I would say a month ago, they felt a lot of political problem with their current and potential markets in Central and Eastern Europe. There was not the legal context so far, but more a political one. So people didn't want to stop, people wanted to postpone, to freeze. And definitely for Rosatom, that was very bad news. Of course, for Rosatom, at some point Rosatom saw one of its major markets in UK. Currently, the situation is not that favorable, at least to my knowledge, for UK either. Again, I could be not familiar with the specific legal implication that happened in recent weeks. I would not be surprised if they did happen, but I would not comment on the things I do not know.
Good afternoon, Vladimir Andreevich. My name is Vyacheslav Romanchev. I am the research associate of National Nuclear Research Institute, MIFI, Moscow, and here I am the CNS fellow, visiting fellow. So I have, first of all, like to thank you for your lecture here, and I have two questions for you. So you mentioned one of the contradictions in Russian politics as between reliance on nuclear weapons from the one side and a development of new conventional weapons from the other side. So development of conventional weapons maybe is not so surprising, and in addition to that, nuclear, both strategical and tactical weapons, nuclear weapons, I mean, are also being modernized. So what do you concretely mean by reliance on nuclear weapons? And do you think that this reliance is something to make Russia, as you call it, renewed great power? And do you agree actually with this concept that Russia now is renewed great power? And the second question will be connected with the relations between the US and Russia. So as soon as you're here. And from my point of view, and as I see it, there are three intersections where these relationships, relations can be useful. There are world terrorism, nuclear sphere, and business, of course. So, do you agree with that? And maybe like in some more spheres, Russia and the USA can cooperate? Because you mentioned like that when something serious happens, Russia always occur to and refer to the USA. But maybe it's not like really like it's not in each and every case right, because I as soon as Russia now maybe is a growing economy, so do you say it's for the USA perspective, it's not very reliable partner? Thank you.
Vyacheslav, right?
Right.
Yeah, thank you, Vyacheslav, for your question, and of course, say hi to Nephi. I have very good memories of my years teaching at the MA program there. Unfortunately, those people who built that program at the university passed away, like Professor Krychkov. So I hope that Nephi now energizes and wish all the best to university. On your two questions, reliance on nuclear weapons. This means that nuclear weapons is viewed as the key, is viewed as vital for providing Russian national security. Well, you can work on further nuclear reductions, but still you keep substantial arsenal for the reasons of preventing military aggression, for the reasons of high prestige internationally, and for the reasons to make your public opinion happy. And of course, all these points are questionable because some may say it's high prestige, others may say it's unfortunate. Some may say that public is happy, others may say that public is unhappy. So far, Russian public feel very comfortable with both the number of nuclear weapons and with how Russia deals with the issue. Russian public will probably be critical, skeptical about new agreements with the United States, or really you should change the course in the propaganda TV channels about that, and maybe in 2 or 3 years Russian public will find out that it's really a good thing to work on the reduction of nuclear weapons, and that New START treaty should be followed by something else, but definitely it's not the case for today. What is important here is the qualitative side. Of course, Russia, as well as other nuclear weapon states, particularly as the United States, it works only on improvements of the quality of its nuclear arsenal. It works on diversity of its nuclear arsenal. It invests heavily in nuclear weapons. Still, compared to investments in our non-nuclear defense sectors, nuclear weapons prove to be relatively cheap. And this is also important. This is also helps sell it to the public. Public easily associates nuclear weapons with the strength and pride of Russia, but actually the figures help prove that in the times of economic uncertainties, but even the military budget, even the defense budget may be questioned for the next 3 or 4 years because of the recession, economic recession in Russia. Then nuclear weapons may be, again, that easier, cheaper, and attractive solution. So it's a combination of very practical military capability and the PR factor. I have no doubt that Russia is in the great power club, and this definitely there. And your question about cooperation, lines of cooperation with the United States. As of today, there are very few. Quite a number diminished just in recent months. There were such things which looked like obvious that our does forever, like cooperation in space programs. Even there are reductions. So everything is affected. Our nuclear cooperation, nuclear security cooperation proved, people were saying it is not effective for some time. It is affected as well. Looking at that isolation and trend in Russia, and of course at the skepticism on Russia here in Washington, I do not see a bright future for nuclear security cooperation either. But there are certain lifelines, if you like, or lines of cooperation, which I think may survive even this time of the Cold War. We discussed already possibility of that non-proliferation discussion on the top, on the most urgent non-proliferation issues between Russia and the United States, regardless of the geography of those issues. Again, Iran will be a good test case to see whether it will stay or even that will disappear or will be completely diminished. There is the second element, is cooperation on financial crimes. Surprisingly, this is what goes on. And Russian delegations come to Washington and actually find that they're almost alone among the Russian delegations coming to Washington these days. But they do their job. Russia and the United States cooperate on FATF, Financial Task Force. It's not as easy as it was before, but actually even the discussions on the proliferation element built in the FATF go on between Russia and the United States on the level business as usual, or business as almost as usual, which for me personally is surprising, but well, it's good it goes on. And last but not least, cyber security. Russia and the United States have a unique agreement on cyber security cooperation, which was signed between the two countries just a few days before Mr. Snowden decided to tell his interesting sagas, first from Hong Kong and later from Moscow. But we have that agreement still in place. And in that sense, it's an interesting non-attack pact. Now Russia is going on to have a similar type of non-attack cyber pact with China. And I think this is very high priority for Russia. So far, it is against the Russian interests to break that pact with the United States. It doesn't mean that it is cyber peace between the two countries, but non-attack on the major cyber warfare issues is viewed as high priority in Moscow. It is hard for me to say how it is viewed these days in Washington, but from the Moscow perspective, this probably should not be killed. Thank you.
It was a very wonderful presentation, and thank you for coming, and we will see you all next Tuesday.